Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, great to see you. Welcome back from Chicago.
Yeah, it's good to be here. It's been a very, very fun, very, very long and exhausting weekend. C2E2 was fantastic. A lot of cool stuff going on, a lot of fun. It is now time to settle back down into normal life and talk some comics.
Yes. Let's, before we jump in and talk about the year in comics, I do want to hear about how the talk went. How did yours and Sienna's panel go on Saturday?
It was fantastic. It was a lot of fun. We had a really nice turnout. Way more people than I had expected would be able to make it up directly at the beginning of Saturday morning to hang out with us and talk about Marvel Unlimited and digital comics. I think there was probably around 30 people there in the room, which is a pretty darn good turnout for a kind of one of the smaller panels. So,
right.
Sienna had a fun time. This is her first time sort of being a speaker on I think probably almost any panel, let alone a panel at a convention this big. So it was a good time, and we got some great questions. Hopefully, we will be able to get a copy of the recording and be able to post it to the site. They do have a certain period of time where ReedPop, who is the sort of the proprietor or the one who runs C2E2, has exclusive rights to any of the audio or video. So we're not going to be posting anything soon, but maybe, I think it's 3 months or something like that. Maybe sometime later we'll be able to put it out as some additional content on the podcast, and if so, we will do that.
Be cool. We'll definitely keep you posted on that. How about the rest of the convention? Did you get a chance to see the rest of the convention?
Yeah, it was amazing. There was a number of folks, as always, a lot of young people doing cool stuff. Sienna found art of all sorts and other interesting sort of kitschy type things. She got, like religious looking candles that had Pedro Pascal and Taika Waititi in sort of the robes of saints or something like this. So she's ready to set up a shrine of some sort. In terms of a lot of the other stuff, I found a lot of interesting comics by younger and established creators that were there selling their stuff. Got a chance to visit with Tom Warzachowski, who was actually somebody we talked about just a little while ago as starting up at Marvel in the early 70s. He is now well established, let's put it that way, but is chugging along, putting out a number of books. He's lettering still every month, mostly working on Spawn, it seems, but then also helping out on some other things too. So just a fantastic guy, phenomenal letterer, has been for decades, one of the good ones. And as we kind of talked about on the podcast, he was one of the first to sort of start dabbling in digital, so he's always been a little ahead of the game. And then at the Hero Initiative, which is a sort of an organization that helps creators, older creators, with some of their bills and things like that, because a lot of times comics didn't treat creators particularly well in terms of helping them save for the future back in the day. Jose Garcia Lopez was signing, and he is one of the finest artists of basically the 70s and 80s. Got a chance to meet him. looked through some of his stuff, including some old original Atari Force pages and stuff. Just in general, they put on a great show. Had a really good time. So exhausted every night I got done. Came back to my friend Mike's house, who was hosting us, and basically just face planted because we were exhausted. So,
Well, I think it's fantastic that you got to go. I'm glad that the panel experience was great and that you got to enjoy the rest of the convention. But I think it's time we start talking about 1975 and the year in comics. What do you say?
absolutely. Let's do it.
The year in comics. All right, Dan, what's going on? What is newsworthy? What is notable about 1975? What should we remember as we're thinking about comics in 1975?
Sure. 75 is still kind of a tough time culturally in America. This is sort of when the last vestiges of Vietnam are getting sorted out. We're still recovering from Watergate, all that sort of stuff. But things are starting to go back to normal a little bit. Some of the economic stuff with the like the oil problems are done. The paper shortage that caused us trouble last year is over, and we are now in fact in a paper glut, which is going to cause its own weird problems.
Okay.
Within comics, we're seeing a number of things happen. First off, we had Atlas Seaboard Comics, the one that Martin Goodman, the publisher originally of Marvel, founded back in late 1973, starting to publish in 74, folds in 75. So,
Wow.
From everything that we can tell, he did a great job of hiring the right people, bringing in folks and giving them creative freedom, and then after about 6 months decided, no, I know how to make comics better than all of the brilliant young comic creators that I've hired, so I'm going to tell them what to do, irritate and anger them until they quit, and then end up with a full line of comics that's terrible because I've tampered with it too much.
Oh, no.
At which point it just goes away. So, kind of unfortunate. They published 23 different comics, though, over the space of these years, and really did try to glut the market and kind of impinge in Marvel's space. Probably the biggest actual remnant of them is that they fundamentally changed a number of things in comics and ended up bringing in a number of reforms, both in terms of pay and in terms of benefits and the return of original art and all of this sort of stuff for writers and artists working at other companies, including Marvel and DC.
Okay.
And then the other thing in terms of folding, Skyward, which is another company that was doing newsstand magazines, ended up folding, again, largely because of Marvel expanding out into the market and taking up space. Over at DC, they decided that Marvel was trying to impinge too much and take over the shelves with all of their new issues. So we know what to do. So they expanded by over 60% their overall line in 1975 to essentially fight fire with fire. Among these are a lot of books I loved, including The Beginning of the Warlord by by Mike Grell, that was introduced in first issue special number 8. The expansion included books like The Joker got his own comic book, Beowulf, Kong, Hercules Unbound, Tor, The Stalker, The Claw, Justice Incorporated, Sherlock Holmes, Batman Family, and Superman Family Giants. There was all sorts of stuff they just vomited onto the market. Unfortunately, we're going to see that this was not a business plan that evidently was well thought out, and the next couple of years are going to be brutal for the books that I just mentioned. Almost none of them survived to make it a year. Right?
Wow.
But they were very aggressive in trying to expand. We also had things going on the underground scene again, with Art Spiegelman and friends establishing a new comics magazine called Arcade, and and then Ron Leishman and Richard Cumley actually published Captain Canuck #1 this year, which is not technically an underground. It was kind of a more mainstream directed superhero comic, but a lot of people call it the first successful attempt to publish a Canadian comic by Canadians since World War II, when essentially the Canadian comic book market sort of collapsed. So, there you go.
I kind of suspected that given the name, Captain Canuck.
Yep.
But okay, that makes total sense.
I have Captain Canuck comics somewhere back in my boxes. They were pretty easy to get in the dollar boxes for a long time. So,
see?
And then outside of that, there's a couple of things in the real world just to note. First is that 1975 is when Neil Adams first started to see the plight that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were in. Both of them were now working as file clerks and things like this, like just regular jobs, and they had no income whatever from Superman, even though it was sort of this massive media property. And in 1975, Warner announced a big Superman movie where they were throwing millions of dollars at directors and actors and everything. And Siegel and Shuster wrote this just scathing editorial and started going on TV and going, we're getting nothing out of all of this. And it was either Siegel or Shuster who actually wrote a newspaper editorial that he put a hex on, or a curse on, the Superman movie. He's like, I hope this movie dies a terrible death, because... And so Neil Adams got involved, brokered a deal with DC because he knew all the DC folks, and because they wanted to avoid bad publicity going into this multi-million-dollar movie, they agreed to put Siegel and Shuster's name back on the books and the credits, where it's got that Superman created by Siegel and Shuster, and to give both men an annual pension for the rest of their life. Not a big pension, like $20,000 a year or something. But to guys who had nothing, this was actually a massive, massive thing that Neil Adams managed. It's still one of kind of the cooler things that he did during a career of very cool things, was actually finding a way to help support Siegel and Shuster in their old age.
That is,
we also
that is fantastic.
It really is. Neil's a cool guy. Was a cool guy. One of the many great creators we've lost in the last couple of years. Linda Carter, actually her version of Wonder Woman, the revised Wonder Woman TV show, debuted this year as well. This is the one that's set in the 1940s. She's fighting Nazis. It's based really on a lot of the old William Marsden comic books of the 40s and 50s, and so really interesting stuff. And this is the one that's, of course, had some success. It went for about 3 years and the like. And then lastly, just because I can't not mention it because it's so weird, because you don't hear of this happening actually to people that often. We did have one underground cartoonist, Von Bode, who met his end in 1975. He created Cheech Wizard, one of the sort of very recognizable underground characters. And he ended up dying of autoerotic asphyxiation at age 33 in 1975.
Okay. That's... Yeah.
Which... Underground cartoonists, man. There you go.
Yeah, so. I guess. Okay. Right, that's a lot of really interesting and noteworthy things that happened in 1975. So how does that translate, or what do we see as far as trends go then for comics during the year?
I think I came across probably 3 or 4 things I'd call major trends. One is that there are a lot of comic series and even comics companies that ended this year. It's become a very difficult market, and especially a difficult market if you are not in the superhero business. Sure. Horror, romance, war, western, sci-fi, all these books took a significant hit in terms of their sales, and most of the books that were brought in to try and stem the tide and new offerings were superhero titles. As an example of this, Archie, apocryphally, It said that their sales fell about 25% in or around 1975, almost across the board, and never really recovered from that. So Archie kind of had they didn't go out of business or anything, but they went from being at one level to at another level that was lower, and then staying at that lower level for a relatively decent time. And then those companies that remained, DC and Marvel primarily, Charlton a little bit, a couple others, mercilessly continued to try and expand and just throw essentially monkey poo at the wall, because some of this stuff was not good, just to take up as much space as possible and to strangle the market, to get rid of other companies and to get rid of competition. So there is a lot of great comics in 1975, and there are a lot of truly terrible comics in 1975.
So when you talked about the expanding previously, specifically with Marvel last year and maybe even the year before, you talked a lot about there being a lot of reprints. Did DC's jump in content in 1975, was that including a lot of reprints as well, or was it more so that it was like partial reprint but also partial new work? Or I guess I'm just curious if they took kind of that same reprint to get more stuff on the racks model that Marvel did, or if they took a little bit different approach.
They'd already done that to an extent. There was a bunch of DC reprint stuff, but a lot of the stuff I mentioned, pretty much all those titles I mentioned in that list, were new content. They were all books that at least primarily were new. Batman Family and Superman Family generally would have one or two new stories at the beginning, and then they would fill them up to giant size with reprints. But most of them had at least some new content in them. So it was new, but it was a lot of young artists in a lot of cases, and a lot of it was very questionable in terms of its quality. There was some great stuff, though. I mean, Warlord was great. I actually really liked some of the other, like a lot of the first issue special stuff. Tor was by Joe Kubert. It was really good. It's just uneven.
So if you were looking at all of 1975, what I see you've got like a top 10 list. What are we talking with regards to what was the best selling in 1975, and what sort of numbers are we talking about?
So Comicron, which is where I normally try to get my numbers from, doesn't have data for these years. From like the most of the 70s into the 80s, they've got a period where they don't have the data collated. But I found another place that actually had comic sales for 74, 75. And this is mostly 1975 reported in 76. And they have Mad, of course, as the big one. Almost 2 million copies in circulation.
Wow.
Number 2 is Superman at basically 1/6 of that, at around 296,000. Amazing Spider-Man 273, Action Comics 231, Superboy 222. So of the top 5, you've got Mad Magazine, a Spider-Man, and 3 Supermans. These are not good Superman comics, as a note. For the most part, this isn't stuff that is tremendous quality. It feels very 1960s still, from looking at them. But Superman was just a juggernaut in the comics industry at this point. So he was outselling everything. Fantastic Four was 6. An Archie comic, just standard Archie, came in at 200,000 in number 7. Then below that we had Thor and Incredible Hulk. And Our Army at War comes in at 191,000 in 10th position. And I think what you'll find is there's a lot of them, probably 11 through 20, that are all kind of not far behind Our Army at War. There's kind of a scrum at that point.
Yeah. But it is interesting to me just how huge Mad Magazine is, because basically you could take 2 through 10 and you don't even equal what Mad was doing at number 1.
That sounds correct. Yep.
That is just amazing, actually, when you think about it. But I recognize though there's definitely some Marvel titles in there, along with the the Superman DC titles. So
Yep. And this is big from what I'm seeing for Marvel, because just a couple years ago in the new data I'm seeing, they wouldn't even get 2 comics in the top 10. And now they actually have, what, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the top 10. So they're making massive inroads.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
All right, Dan, we've talked about the year as a whole for comics in 1975. What did the year 1975 look like for Marvel?
If you look at like an interstate highway and every car on the highway is a new comic book being published, or, you know, crashing into the ditch because it's being canceled, that would be the year in Marvel, pretty much. They averaged about 40 comics a month during the year, for a total published in Marvel in books total, and this is not just Marvel Universe. It would include like the Millie the Models and the Westerns and stuff. But they published 474 comics under the Marvel imprint in 1975.
Wow.
Tons of these were new titles. There also were a ton of them that were canceled. So if you look at the list that I've got there, I believe we have 24 new comics, and we have something along the lines of 21 canceled comics.
Okay.
So the new books are Adventures on the Planet of the Apes, Champions, Giant Size, and I'm not going to say giant size for each of these, so until further notice, it's giant size. Chillers, Daredevil, Hulk, Invaders, Iron Man, Kid Colt, Marvel Triple Action, Supervillain Team Up, and to end it, Giant Size X-Men. So those were all new titles for Giant Size. Then you've still got Invaders, Inhumans, Iron Fist, Marvel Adventures, Marvel Chillers, Marvel Feature, Marvel Presents, Rawhide Kid, Skull the Slayer, Son of Satan, and Supervillain Team Up.
Now refresh my memory. Giant Sized was the larger, like, magazine style comic, and it had more pages and a higher price point. Is that what remember that correctly?
The giant sizes are going to be the ones that are sort of more perfect bound. They've got the square bound end to them, instead of just a staple, and they're usually going to be in the area of 64 pages or something like that. And normally they're going to be 1 or 2 stories and then a bunch of reprints at the end.
Gotcha.
So it's Marvel's way of charging some extra dough and being able to get that page count up without having to do a whole lot of new stuff. It's also frustrating when you look at them in Marvel Unlimited, because in many cases they pull out all of the reprint content and just do the new stuff. And so the books aren't necessarily actually the size they should be when you look at them in Marvel Unlimited. So you can't really tell what was in them sometimes. But so much new stuff in here. It's crazy. And a lot of them were something where you'd get like the giant size Supervillain Team Up, and then the book would come out, or giant size Invaders, and then the book Invaders would come out. So it wasn't necessarily 24 new ideas. It was 24 new titles, many of which were only 1 or 2 issues.
All right, so we had this glut of new comics. You talked about there being a pretty extensive library of books that ended. What does that look like?
I think you'll be able to see some real themes here, because if you think about the non-giant size books that end, they are Adventure into Fear, ends with 31, Dead of Night with 11, Frankenstein Monster with 18, Supernatural Thrillers with 15, Outlaw Kid at 30, Unknown Worlds of Science Fiction with 6, War is Hell at 15, Western Gunfighters 33, and Where Monsters Dwell number 38.
Those are a lot of not superhero books.
Yep, almost everything they published that was Western or war or horror got the chop. And so by the end of this year, really all you've got left is you've got Tomb of Dracula, you've got Werewolf by Night, there's 1 or 2 other ones that survive, but most of these books get taken out. We also see the end of Giant Size Avengers, Giant Size Chillers, Giant Size Conan, Giant Size Defenders, Giant Size Fantastic Four, Giant Size Man Thing, Giant Size Master of Kung Fu, Giant Size Spider-Man, Giant Size Supervillain Team Up, and Giant Size Werewolf by Night.
So some of these that started this year also ended this year. They did like superhero team up didn't, supervillain team up didn't. Is that 2 issues that they
Yep,
did?
it only had 2 issues. That is correct. None of them were just 1 issue. They all made at least 2. But that and Giant Size X-Men, I guess, was also number 2 is the only one. So they all had at least a couple. But it was a lot of churn. I mean, it's a lot of churn. So
yeah, I mean, anytime. I would never suspect that if you started a comic in a year that it would end in the same year. Like, it just seems like, and I know, like, nowadays it does seem like there's very limited series, 6 to maybe 8 issues and stuff. And so if you started early in the year, it could presumably end in the same year. But it didn't seem like that was necessarily the case, or that wasn't what they were setting out to do back around this time, right?
you almost never saw this back in the day. And the reason was primarily because the companies were cheap. Because you had to register postal registrations for each new title when you did them. So that's why it was better to, instead of changing the renumbering, they would simply change the name of an existing title and move it in, because then you didn't have to pay as much to the post office for re-registration. So this sort of thing, when they're bringing in new titles and moving out old ones, I think it was partly due to changes in the way that the market worked. Once you start dealing with the direct market as a primary place you're selling to, you don't have to worry so much about what it costs you for postage. And so they're starting to change the way they do things. But also, we're just getting to that point where there are a lot of titles that come out that just don't grab an audience quickly and they cancel them.
Sure.
There's a lot less patience than there maybe was back in the day.
Gotcha. All right. Well, so we had these new books. How about new characters? Is there any new characters that really grab the attention and end up having some staying power?
Characters that might be worth doing an entire podcast over at some point.
So, I mean, you know,
it's possible.
It's possible.
Yep. My number one character this year is Moon Knight. But I would be lying if I tried to tell you that was actually the most important character who was brought in this week. If we start with some of the lower hanging fruit, we've got White Tiger, we've got Nova, Korvac, Razor Fist comes in Kung Fu. We've got a bunch of supporting characters like Vast Astrovink, Janice Foswell, Gloria Grant, Harold in Tomb of Dracula, Masterman, Moses Magnum, Ben Reilly, who is the Spider clone, so he's Spider-Man's clone. He's not actually known initially kind of as Ben Reilly, but we find that later. We get Shroud, Strawman, U-Man. But outside of Moon Knight and Nova and maybe White Tiger, the main characters for the year are all mutants. And that is because Giant Size X-Men #1 comes out and introduces us to the new X-Men, which they're going to eat up Marvel Comics for the next 20 years or so. The primary new characters we see in that one are Colossus, Nightcrawler, Storm, and Thunderbird. And of those, 3 of them are going to be long-term members of the team. Thunderbird actually dies off just a couple of issues into the new X-Men, which makes a lot of people angry because you've got a Native American character, really the first, other than Red Wolf, who wasn't exactly a superhero, first Native American superhero for Marvel, and they just whack him 2 issues into the run of the new series. But he has come back since, and there's other members of his family that are also now heroes and everything like that. But at the time, he was dead for quite a long time. The thing about the team is it's international as well. So Colossus is from Russia, Nightcrawler's German. Storm actually has a really weird heritage. She's American, but had a half Kenyan heritage, and then her family moved to Egypt when she was young, and she was raised in the streets of Egypt. Essentially, ended up being something happened to her parents, and she ended up being essentially just a street urchin running around in Egypt. So many of the other characters, like Wolverine, we'll see he's Canadian, etc. The idea was they were looking to find new ways to appeal to different audiences and maybe an international audience, and so that was one of the plans of the X-Men. Other mutants, Moira McTaggart was introduced, who at the time we believed was actually a human and was not that big a character. Over the last few years, we found out she's one of the most powerful mutants in the entire Marvel Universe, and has in fact basically reshaped the entire universe dozens or hundreds of times. And so she's more important than we maybe thought. Jamie Madrox, another mutant who is introduced in Fantastic Four. We met Colossus's younger sister, Ilyana. She was not, at that point, actually turned into magic or whatever. She was just his little sister. He left when he went off to America. And then we have Stephen Lang as well. So, lots of new characters. But primarily, we're talking Moon Knight and the X-Men.
Gotcha.
And,
all right.
And maybe if you're listening to this in 3 or 4 years and they get the Nova movie off the ground and Nova becomes huge, then maybe we're talking Moon Knight and Nova and the X-Men. But we'll see.
There we go. All right, so new characters. What about big moments in 1975 in Marvel Comics?
I mean, the big moment is Giant Size X-Men #1. And that new team created by Len Wein and Dave Cockrum. Relatively soon after that, though, we have Uncanny X-Men #94, where Wein has actually taken over as the editor-in-chief at Marvel. He's busy. He can't do this book. And depending on who you hear it from, either Wein decides to give Claremont the assignment for X-Men, or Claremont bothers Wein incessantly until he finally breaks down and just gives him the assignment for X-Men.
Sure.
But regardless, it's a perfect pairing. He takes over with X-Men '94, and for the next 17 years, he is writing the primary X-Men title, as well as, in many cases, 3 or 4 other X books, pretty much every month for Marvel. So,
wow,
this is the beginning of that pairing.
Gotcha.
And relatively soon, next year or the year after, Byrne will come on with, I think, issue 108, and then you get the Claremont Byrne Golden Age, and etc. But it starts here with getting the writer on board.
Right.
We also get a couple other super teams. We get the Invaders, who are set in the 1940s. That was a Roy Thomas thing. And then we get the Champions, who are kind of a little attempt at a hipper kind of team. They've got Hercules and some of these others. They're sort of more fun, driving around, Ghost Rider on his motorcycle and everything. I loved Invaders. I also loved another one that Roy Thomas did. He was a big fan of the Golden Age heroes, and so he not only did the Invaders to bring back those characters, or to focus on 1940s stories of Marvel characters in the Invaders, but over at DC he created a team called the All-Star Squadron, which focused on DC heroes from the Golden Age during World War II. And so both of those are actually really good books. That one, All-Star Squadron's probably still 4 or 5 years down the road. But I think I've mentioned this before. Key, because 2 of the first 3 comics I ever bought were All-Star Squadron related. So they will always have a place in my heart.
There we go.
Outside of that, there's a number of attempts by Marvel to diversify its line, even as it's closing these things down. So it did bring out a couple of sci-fi adaptations, some other attempts at doing some things that are kind of horror related, that sort of thing. Just, they don't seem to be willing to give up entirely on it, but it is getting obvious, it seems, that where the market is leading them at this point is into the superhero realm more dominant.
Okay.
Within some of the stories, Captain America takes up the shield and costume again. He'd been rolling around as Nomad, the man without a country. But after this time, a young guy decided that America needed Captain America and took up the costume and got himself killed. And he's like, this is like the fourth time in the last year somebody's gotten killed trying to be Captain America. I think I'd better take this back again. So, and I think just as a matter of the way the country was going, this is sort of, Captain America had to take some time off, but you can't have the flag get half-mast forever. So
right,
Cap comes back, and he's going to have some very good stories over the next half decade or so here. Jim Starlin reinvents Adam Warlock as sort of the trippy space/time god that we've read about. These are some of my favorite stories of this period, actually, are these Starlin Adam Warlock books. Howard the Duck, we find out, who we thought had been killed in one of the Man-Thing stories, is in fact actually safe and alive and in Cleveland, because Steve Gerber's a nut. And so that's getting kicked off again. We found Gwen Stacy returns, kind of. Evidently Stan Lee had been going around to college campuses and fielding mail for years where people are just like, all right, when are you going to bring Gwen Stacy back? When are you going to find some way to make good the fact that you guys screwed this up? And he's like, well, it's going to be good. And so they brought her back, but it's a Gwen Stacy clone that was created sort of by an evil scientist, and then everything kind of goes bad, and eventually she leaves town. They didn't kill her, but it's not Gwen Stacy really returning. It was a misdirect. But they played it up. They've got like covers. The first cover was Spider-Man going, "But you're dead," and there's this. All you see is a woman's leg with that white Gwen Stacy boot kind of standing there in front of him, and so they played on people's heartstrings, and then they crushed them again, it seems. So.
Wow.
And then lastly, on an upbeat note, Vision and Scarlet Witch actually end up getting married in an Avengers title this year at the end of sort of the Celestial Madonna storyline. So we had this big, long saga by Englehart where he talks about Mantis and kind of her journey. And she ends up marrying the swordsman and heading off into space, and Vision and Scarlet Witch get married as well. So, yeah.
It's a lot of interesting moments in 1975, it sounds like.
75, kind of like with DC, has some really great comics and some really terrible comics. But the good ones were really good.
All right, well, let's talk about the people making those comics. Who is in the bullpen for Marvel in 1975?
So, again, I'm still dealing with reprints, so I swear while I try to do this constantly. But basically, you've got Jerry Conway, Steve Englehart, Steve Gerber, Len Wein, Roy Thomas, Doug Mensch, Mike Friedrich, Mark Wolfman, Tony Isabella, and Don McGregor all writing stories for you. And that is an absolutely fantastic cast of writers. Like, these guys are almost all of them either in the Comic Hall of Fame or they're going to be in the Comic Hall of Fame sometime, right?
Okay.
So it's a really, really impressive group of writers, each who have kind of their own specialty. Some of them are young and still sort of figuring out how to do things at this point, but it's a very promising group. For pencilers or pencil artists, layouts, John Buscema, Sal Buscema, Rich Buckler, Gene Colan, Gil Kane, Ross Andrew, Jim Mooney, Dick Ayers, Mike Plug, and Herb Trumpy are the ones who seem to be the ones getting the most credits. And then for inkers, we've got Vinnie Coletta leading the way. not because he's the best, but because he's the fastest. Like, this is one thing. I am not a Vince Coletta fan, but he is somebody who was really popular with editors because he would get the job done. And there's the old, if you want to succeed in comics, you can be good, fast, or friendly. And any two of the three will probably get you there. And he was fast, and he evidently was really friendly, and people liked him. And so,
okay,
there you go. Mike Esposito, Frank Joka, Jack Abel, Dick Ayers, Dave Hunt, Frank Tremonti, Klaus Janson, Dick Giordano, and Tom Palmer also were doing a lot of inking stuff. On the colorist side, we had Petra Goldberg, Linus Oliver, Linda Lessman, George Roussos, and Stan Goldberg. And at letterer, this is kind of Artie Simic with 111, John Costanza 85, Tom Lorzachowski 34, Dave Hunt 30, Gaspar Saladino 23, and Charlotte Jetter 19. So, but there were some changes going on too. So one thing you don't see here is Jack Kirby actually returned to Marvel this year. There's ads in the comics for Marvel talking about Kirby's return. There's a bullpen bulletins from Stan Lee talking about his return. We won't actually see any new Jack Kirby pages until 1976. I think there's actually some covers in late 75 that come out that he did, but no interior pages, which is what I'm looking at when I do the creator lists.
Sure. That surprises me, given everything that happened between Lee and Kirby and him leaving, and I guess I assumed that if he ever came back that it was going to take significantly longer for that to happen.
It was about 5 years, and that was about the length of his contract with DC. And once his contract was up, Marvel got a new one. Lee and Kirby pretty much buried the hatchet, at least temporarily, enough that he would come back. And I think it helped that Lee wasn't day-to-day working on things anymore. Plus, Kirby got pretty much a do-whatever-you-want type of contract, much like he'd wanted with DC. So,
sure.
Outside of that, we've got Len Wein actually replaces Marv Wolfman, or Len Wein is replaced by Marv Wolfman. So Len Wein had actually taken over the editor-in-chief job from Roy Thomas just like a year previous. And it turns out that it was stressing him out so bad that he was doing like amphetamines and losing sleep and not able to get things done because it was so stressful for him. And he's like, forget this. So Marv Wolfman takes over instead. Which was fine, but one problem with that was that evidently at some point Thomas had promised Jerry Conway that he would be in line for the editor-in-chief job if it came open. And when Wolfman got it instead, Conway actually left, which means that by the end of the year, we're seeing credits for Jerry Conway over at DC. So he leads the list in terms of most books written for Marvel during 75, but by the end of the year, he's not even working there anymore. Similarly, kind of on a sad note, Artie Simic, who's basically been leading our letterer stats for ages, actually passed away this year at age 59. So most of the guys that we're talking about actually are going to live some pretty long lives. They'll be around for a while, and we won't be seeing them, leaving this way for a long time. But Simic actually did essentially die in the lettering chair. He was 59. And passed away. So, but that's kind of where we are right now. Kirby's back, Simic's out, Conway's out, Marv Wolfman is in the big chair.
Goodness, those are some pretty big changes when you think about it, because Conway's been like the lead writer, it feels like, as far as credits go, for like the last couple years, and again this year, and to think he's not even, as we leave 1975, he's not even with the company anymore. It's actually pretty crazy. let's shift the look to the newcomers then for 1975 and talk about our Rookie of the Year. Who are the new people, and who is the one that is going to go on to have the big career and get the Rookie of the Year for 1975?
So this was kind of a crazy year, and I think we're going to have a lot of these coming up. But there was probably about 20 people who debuted with Marvel this year. I've winnowed it down to 6 people to mention. 4 of them I'm going to say are, semi-honorable mentions, right? We've got Jim Shooter, who eventually becomes editor-in-chief of Marvel. He has a huge impact on the company, both good and bad. There are people who love Jim Shooter and people who hate Jim Shooter. There are very few people in between.
Okay.
But it's also hard to consider him a rookie when, if you'll remember, he was the guy writing Legion of Superheroes at age 14, like back in the early 60s. So he actually left comics. He was writing from age like 13 to 18. He left comics to go to college, got a job in advertising afterwards, and then was sucked back into working for DC and then Marvel in 1975-76. So, very important guy, but this is definitely not a rookie. It would be weird to consider him such a thing.
This is the Ichiro Suzuki, where he had a career...
A career so substantial at the other league with DC that I don't think it makes sense to call him a rookie when he debuts at Marvel.
Yes.
We have Janice Shang, who is a letterer, who worked for a long time for the company, had a substantial career over like 20-some years with tons of credits. Similarly, Jim Novak is a letterer who started here and has a very long career. It was interesting when I was talking to Orzechowski this weekend, in fact, that he mentioned that even though he started before Novak for a long time, Novak was sort of a gold standard at the company. That it seems like this is somebody that even somebody as good as Tom Orzechowski really respected Jim Novak's work. So
okay,
I thought that was pretty cool. We also have Terry Austin, who's an inker who worked on so many books. He is relatively famous for inking John Byrne and doing a fantastic job at that. He's also inked just about everybody else, and his line work is so clean. Everything he does is beautiful. Terry Austin is one of my favorite inkers of all time. He's also in the Joe Sinnott Inking Hall of Fame as of 2009. He's not currently in the actual Eisner Hall of Fame yet, but more than likely he will be sometime soon, I would think.
Okay.
But then we come down. Yep.
Oh, I was going to lead you into the last two.
Go ahead.
All right, so you've got these 4 that were the almost honorable mention. That must mean that these last 2, the winner and maybe the runner-up / honorable mention, must be pretty big.
Yeah, and in fact, I made a note that to me this is kind of a Ty Cobb versus Lou Gehrig decision, right? You've got 2 guys who are fantastic creators, one of whom is also one of the nicest guys in comics, and one of whom is one of the most difficult guys in comics.
Okay.
So we're going to start with the honorable mention, which is the nicest guys in comics phase, which is Walter Simonson. He is a comic god by all accounts. There's no real way that he should ever finish behind anybody at anything. He's an Eisner Hall of Famer since 2017. He worked for Marvel on the Hulk, on the Fantastic Four, had a long run on X Factor with his wife Louise, and of course he's famous for his run on Thor, where for years he just built this fantastic body of work that sort of revolutionized Thor and made him a much more important character and a much more interesting character than he'd ever been.
I remember reading some of the Walt Simonson Thor books, and those were some really amazing stories. I mean, really, really amazing. And you're talking a guy that did seem like he's it's almost that he's too powerful and so he then sometimes can be not very interesting. And I remember some of my initial impressions of Thor being that I didn't really care for him because I didn't think he was that interesting. And then we start reading some of the Simonson books, and I'm just completely changed my mind on the character. And it had so much to do with just the stories that he was telling and like the universe that he was building around Thor, that it was just amazing.
Yep. And the thing is that one of the other things about him is that this is not a guy who's a one-trick pony. There are people who wrote a lot of stories. There's people who drew a lot of stories. But Walt Simonson is one of those people who actually is able to do the full project. He is able to write the story. He will do a beautiful job laying it out and penciling it. And his inking style is absolutely amazing. Like the line work he uses and the way he finishes the art. So it is very difficult to imagine somebody who isn't Kirby who would have been able to come in and have a bigger impact as a total package than Walt Simonson. But I have to apologize because the weird thing is there's another guy this same year who is also the total package and who I think you just have to admit over time has done more in terms of the amount of content he's done for Marvel and has had astonishingly a greater impact. So our winner, oh, go ahead.
So who is this mystery man then? Who could outdo Walt Simonson and be the Rookie of the Year for 1975?
Walt Simonson has been out Walt Simonsoned by John Byrne, I'm afraid. So Byrne, again, a comic book god. This is a guy who was inducted into the Eisner Hall of Fame in 2015. He started out at Marvel on Iron Fist with Chris Claremont. He did a long run on the X-Men that sort of redefined the new X-Men. He's the guy that decided that Wolverine should be Canadian because he was Canadian and he wanted to have a Canadian superhero. He had a really nice run penciling the Avengers that I liked a lot. He took over Fantastic Four with issue 232 and had a massive run where he wrote and drew it, what a lot of people call the second golden age of the Fantastic Four, that essentially you've got like Lee Kirby and then you've got John Byrne, right? And there have been other golden ages since. But the Fantastic Four had always been called the world's greatest comic magazine. But for most of its 100s, it was not. So during the 70s, the FF was not spectacular. And John Byrne came in and he just completely rejuvenated that title and those characters. He created a Canadian super team called Alpha Flight that he had a long run as the writer on, and that has continued on to this day. He had a run on Avengers West Coast, where again, he did the writing and art. He did the second She-Hulk series, where again, he did the writing and the art. He did Namor. Later on, he returned to the X-Men with both a series called Hidden Years, which was published by Marvel, and one called Elsewhen, where he decided Marvel wouldn't let him do X-Men the way he wanted, so he just made his own and gave it away for free on the internet. Because he wanted to. So those have since been published here or then. And they're fantastic too. But he did a lot of interesting things. You know, it's not just that he worked on one character or did one defining thing. He's a defining artist or writer on X-Men and on Fantastic Four and on She-Hulk and some of the best Namor stuff that's been written that's been done. Plus, he makes his own teams like Alpha Flight. He really did do a ton of stuff for Marvel. And it's things like even weird things like She-Hulk breaking the fourth wall. That was a Byrne thing initially, right? And now it's become a defining part of her character. So, right. Yeah. So he wins. He really is a grumpy old man. Like he literally has a website. For most of the early 2000s, he had his own bulletin board where you could go out and talk to him, and he was just abusive to people on it. And he can be really difficult. But that does no way diminish the fact that, man, is he a great comic creator? So,
I think that I think that makes sense. I mean, yeah, you look at the work across all those different characters, and yeah, John Byrne, winner of the Rookie of the Year for 1975. The year in Daredevil.
all right, sir. We have finished up talking about Marvel, finished up about comics. Now we got the man himself, Daredevil, to talk about. What is it that you've got for us to talk about this year in the world of Daredevil?
All right, so Daredevil had a big year, actually. When you look at it, his main book, we're going to be looking at issues 117 through 128, but he also did have a number of appearances outside of his main book. In Deadly Hands of Kung Fu number 8, The Giant-Sized Defenders number 3. He was in Thor number 233, and he appeared in 2 issues of The Defenders, numbers 24 and 25. We're not going to end up spending much time talking about those other appearances because there's a lot that happens during the main Daredevil run that we need to get to. And we're going to start by talking about the fact that there was actually a number of writers that worked on Daredevil this year. So it wasn't just the one person like we had seen previously for a lot of the last few years. This year it started with Chris Claremont and Steve Gerber with issue 117. We had Jerry Conway doing issue 118. We had Tony Isabella doing 119 to 122. We then had Len Wein and Marv Wolfman in 124, and then Marv Wolfman basically ended the year as the main writer on the Daredevil series. Conversely to that, Bob Brown, William Robert Brown, who we pretty much did all of last year, 1974, continued on to provide most of the art for 1975. And what I noticed this year was about halfway through the year, Klaus Janson joined him, and it seemed like there was pencils by Bob Brown and ink by Klaus Janson. But as we kind of go into the end of 1975 and into 1976, spoiler alert for next year, they kind of get co-artist credit where they don't really necessarily define the role of art penciler versus inker going forward. And what I would say is I really enjoyed the books that Klaus Janson worked with Bob Brown on.
Klaus Janson is an absolute master of his craft. He actually was at the convention at C2E2 this week. I got to visit with him a little bit, and then also there was a line of younger guys standing there with their work to come up and ask him to kind of take a look at it and the like. So I have to listen in on him giving sort of like tips to a few young artists. And
really?
So, yeah, he was really generous with his time and with his comments, I thought. But he is somebody who, like, he'll come back to this title and work with Frank Miller in a while here, like as we approach the end. And then he takes over as penciler on some of that as well. And it's interesting because Janson is such a good draftsman that it seems like a lot of his pencilers almost just get too relaxed because they're like, if I just draw a circle, Klaus will turn it into a fully formed drawing, right?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because you look at a lot of this work with Brown and it doesn't look that different from some of the Frank Miller stuff we're going to see around issue like 190.
Really?
Because
okay.
Janson is a very powerful inker. He's someone you have to be a very strong stylist to not get overpowered by. And I think that's one of the reasons why him and Frank Miller worked well together, is Miller's stuff has this sort of dynamism where it's Frank Miller, where Janson can't beat him into the ground. But everything he finishes looks beautiful. So I understand why. And it also does make sense to me why he does get that co-credit on a lot of the art. Because he is somebody who a lot of times thrives under more of the breakdowns and finishes structure instead of the penciler and inker. He's an artist in his own right, more than just somebody who's, doing the Ben Affleck tracing. That's not his gig. So.
There you go. The only other artist I really saw getting credit on the Daredevil books this year was Don Heck. He provided the art for issue 118. So as far as talking about the stories for this year, the year starts, if you recall, Owl had actually beaten and captured Black Widow and Daredevil and had put them on his Owl chopper and said he basically had a plan to do with them as he pleases. And what we find out is the Owl is going to try and steal Daredevil's mind, but he agrees to release him if Black Widow kidnaps someone, and that someone turns out to be Shauna the She-Devil. And the two women end up working together to trick the Owl and save Daredevil. So it was actually quite amusing, I guess, to me that, he's going to steal Daredevil's mind and then kind of gets talked into doing this other thing. And then it ends up being somebody else that we've seen recently help Daredevil and Black Widow. And then they work together and get Daredevil saved. So there you go.
Yep.
Next up, we do have Daredevil lost his Billy Club at the end of last year, but he gets it returned thanks to Ivan Petrovich. Though Black Widow does decide to return to San Francisco, so she does not stay in New York after helping to save him.
Is it his Billy Club original, or did Petrovich make him a new one?
He made him a new one.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yes, he made him a new one. So
because there's a point where Black Widow's like, don't think he's not smart because his English isn't good. If he's talking in Russian, he makes Tony Stark sound like a moron or something like this. So the idea is that he's far more than a chauffeur. So.
Right. Yeah. Apparently he's got some engineering skills as well. And so, it's not just Daredevil that can build his Billy Club back when he needs it. After that, Daredevil then takes on the circus of crime and saves New York City from being hypnotized and losing all their money. One member of that group, though, Black Wing, gets away, and that turns out to actually be a pretty important point, as we find out a little bit later on in the year. Next up, Daredevil then sees Pop Fenton. If you remember Pop Fenton, he's his battling Murdock, Matt's dad, his old trainer. And he attempts to save him and a former boxer who's now a priest, Father Gawain, from Juan Aponto, who has been working with a doctor who recreated Iron Man's villain, the Crusher's strength formula. And after the battle, and the Crusher is defeated, he ends up dying in Pop Fenton's arms. So that ends up being kind of a sad end to a relatively new villain.
And that one's another weird one where, wasn't it that somehow it was like the mortician or something like this who was dealing with the other Crusher's body extracted somehow the secret or whatever, and so
that is exactly
stealing powers from a dead guy. I mean, it's pretty morbid.
Yes, so. that is that. Apparently, during the autopsy, yes, the mortician figured out a way to harness or extract and reverse engineer the strength formula, and then was giving it to this new boxer who wanted to be a heavyweight fighter, and it caused him then to actually become all like the Crusher from the Iron Man series. It was really weird.
It's messed up, man.
So as we continue through the year, New Year's arrives and Black Widow comes to visit Daredevil in New York. They end up attending a New Year's Eve party that gets thrown by Foggy Nelson. Though Black Widow definitely not happy about going and seeing Foggy Nelson. If you recall why, Foggy put her on trial and was trying to make an example of her because he was being blackmailed at the time. And yeah, it was not great. Though it ends up working out for the best, however, because agents of Hydra end up attacking the party, and they're led by El Jaguar. We learn the reason Hydra attacks the party is because Foggy is being considered for the advisory committee for S.H.I.E.L.D. and just hasn't been asked yet, which is actually pretty crazy. And eventually Foggy ends up getting captured by Hydra when Foggy gives himself up to save the Black Widow from the Dreadnought. So there is a really selfless act by Foggy at the end of the book, and it causes Black Widow to just go thermonuclear, I think, is probably the best way to put it. She immediately goes from I hate Foggy Nelson to I'm going to get Foggy Nelson back, and I'm going to make those that took him pay worse than anybody else has ever done to anybody ever. So it was quite the transformation, and I really actually kind of appreciated it.
I wasn't the only one who noticed that then. But yeah. You did not want to be the one she was angry at the end of that comic, because she looked like she was going to hurt somebody.
He was very, very angry. Yeah. So after this, Black Widow and Daredevil scour the city looking for Foggy and end up fighting El Jaguar and Blackwing, who turns out to be the son of the Supreme Hydra, Silvermane. As Fury's forces then head into a trap to try and get Hydra, we find out that they're able to avoid said trap with the cunning use of life model decoys. And so that's the first time we've seen a reference to life model decoys during the Daredevil run. And it was,
they're always just as goofy as they are the previous time. So... Yeah. We saw them in Moon Knight, and we've seen them a few other times. So, for those who haven't seen them, a life model decoy is basically a robot that S.H.I.E.L.D. has around that just occasionally seems to be taking the place of whoever it is that's going to die unexpectedly that week. And then they can say, oh, it was just a robot.
Worked out really well as a diversion tactic, I guess, because in the final battle with Hydra, we see the Black Widow destroying the Dreadnought by shooting it in its only weak spot. Daredevil then goes up against Jackhammer and easily defeats him. El Jaguar is knocked out by Dum Dum Dugan, and Mankiller is incapacitated when Ivan places a jamming device on her exoskeleton. With their plans failing, the Blackwing and Silvermane make a hurried escape, and the remaining Hydra agents are captured. And it is that point Fury asks one last time, Foggy, will you join S.H.I.E.L.D.? And he says, absolutely not. And he's standing in the middle of Shea Stadium, and it's all kind of blown up, and all sorts of weird craziness goes on, because apparently Hydra had a secret facility underneath Shea Stadium.
There you go.
Like you do, I guess.
Oh my goodness.
After that long story arc, we had Daredevil taking on Copperhead, who is a real-life recreation of a 1930s comic book. This two-book story arc is actually going to be this week's Spotlight, so we'll talk about that in much more detail a little bit later. We see a new Tornado show up looking to complete an important mission, but when he's killed during a battle with Daredevil, a former pro quarterback, Brock Jones, takes the costume and wants to complete the mission. Those two then fight as Jones attempts to explain that mission to Daredevil and why he needs to do it. In the process, they end up destroying the home of an innocent family, and the fight only ends when the mother yells at them for the destruction, thus causing them to stop fighting and just walking away. It was actually a really weird kind of thing, and they're just pummeling each other and just destroying this house as this innocent family just looks on as their house is just destroyed and they're trying not to be killed. And finally, the mother of the family just says, enough. Look at what you two are doing to our house. How can you do this? You're supposed to be heroes. And then they're like, oh, sorry. And then they just sort of walk away. And that's how it ends. It's so weird.
Oh my goodness.
And the year ends with Murdock saying he's done with being Daredevil because of that fight with Torpedo. But it doesn't last long, as he's needed to take on Deathstalker, who's stealing artifacts from a museum in an attempt to build a powerful weapon. In their final battle, Deathstalker ends up disappearing while standing on a platform during near a mysterious Skywalker. Now, Dan, that's the best explanation I can give for what happens in that last issue at the end of the year. I don't know who the Skywalker is, where Deathstalker ended up. Do you have can you shine any light on either of those things for me?
Here's the weird thing that happens with this. If you've noticed some of these books, like you said, there's a lot of writers, right? So evidently, this character was introduced by Marv Wolfman, and his plan was he was going to take Daredevil into space and make an actual like sci-fi adventure for him or something like this. So the Skywalker was sort of the intro to that. But unfortunately, he was unsatisfied kind of with what was going on. He didn't like the direction it seemed like it was taking. So instead, he said, I think I'm just going to tap out and go off the title. And the new writers that came on didn't really know what to do with the character or have any interest in it. So evidently, I think there's only like one or two other appearances, probably like 3 total appearances of this character ever in the history of Marvel. And as of right now, it is just a dead end.
Okay. So it ends up being kind of as weird as it sort of seemed as I was reading the issue.
It literally, what you get there is exactly what it is. There's this weird guy who comes in, and he looks like he's super important, and then he's not.
Very good. I love it. That's great.
Comics.
Yes. All right, let's talk about new powers, new toys, new places. Obviously, for the most part, all of this ends up being in and around the New York area. We see Shea Stadium and Hydra's underground six-floor underground layer underneath Shea Stadium. One thing I'll note is in issue 128, we do see a diagram of Matt Murdock's new brownstone, his new house, where he's staying. I thought it looked actually remarkably similar to the apartment he previously had in New York, but it was really interesting as they gave Bob Brown did sort of this like X-ray look thing of it, and I thought it looked really cool how he ended up displaying it in that issue.
Mm-hmm.
So we had that, and then as far as like new toys, we saw something new with the Billy Club. Apparently, in addition to like little pellets and nutrient tablets and things like this, the Billy Club can hold some Subway tokens as well. So he actually pulls out some Subway tokens in issue 119. And you mentioned in Giant Size Defenders, he's good at winning coin flips.
That's one of the things he has is there's a coin flip against the Grandmaster with basically the Earth on the line, and so he's like, "I'll flip you for it," and the Grandmaster's sure, and so Matt Murdock flips the coin, Daredevil flips the coin, and it comes up and he calls heads or whatever, and it's heads, and the Grandmaster's, wow, you got lucky this time, Daredevil. But then as they're going back, the Defenders are like, that's pretty ballsy, betting the entire fate of Earth on a coin flip. He's like, I can't tell them, but my super senses mean that I can sense exactly how to flip the coin so that the weight works out perfectly, so I can always flip heads 100 times or whatever.
Wow.
So evidently,
all right,
cheating at games of chance is another of Daredevil's skills. So
excellent.
Mm-hmm.
As far as supporting characters that we saw this year, Dr. Jackalbur was the doctor who recreated the treatment that caused the new Crusher to occur during the Pop Fenton issue. We saw Dr. Armstrong Smith, who is a computer guru helping Foggy create a new law enforcement gizmo. That he actually called it a gizmo several times, and he was actually really proud of calling it a gizmo for whatever reason. But it could potentially could identify villains based on attributes of the crime being committed. It is in essence what it was doing. So you could put in, I think they did some random example of like from New York and like something to do with chicken and something else, and they were able to narrow it down to like four people or something. And so but it's still a work in progress apparently as well. But
yes,
there you go. We have Blake Towers, who is running against Foggy Nelson for the DA. We find out who Foggy is running against in his re-election campaign. And then we have Heather Glenn, who is quite possibly one of the weirdest characters I think I've ever seen. And definitely the introduction to her is one of the weirdest things ever. She is a woman that shows up to Matt Murdock's new apartment looking for her old boyfriend, realizes that he doesn't live there anymore, and just keeps showing up and suddenly becomes interested in Matt Murdock. And spoiler alert, I guess, for 1976, he becomes interested in her as well. I'm not wrong. The Heather Glenn is weird. That character is weird, and the introduction of it is weird.
It's so weird, and I mean, she ends up in kind of Tony Stark stories, and all sorts of things happen. This is a very strange situation. And then, why is this socialite working? Well, I guess she's not yet, but why? Yeah, spoilers for future. She turns into their secretary at some point. Why is she their secretary? I don't understand any of the things going on with this character, but she'll have all sorts of things happening, and there are some very dark things going on later on in her life. So we will see that as we near the end. I can't remember what issue exactly. But it gets bad.
Yeah. We have Brock Jones, the former quarterback, who's now in insurance and wants to get back into the limelight and becomes the new Torpedo. And then that Skywalker person who apparently was going to be a bigger deal than they turned out to actually be. As far as new villains this year, we had the Circus of Crime, led by the Ringmaster. Others in that is Blackwing, who has a connection to bats, the Great Gambonos, Princess Python, and Precious, which is her pet python. We also had Cannonball as part of that group. We saw the new Crusher, who is the Juana Ponto, who wanted to become the heavyweight and became the Crusher after getting those treatments. We had obviously Hydra, the well-known villain group from the Captain America books. We have the El Jaguar, who is the head of the Commando Division at Hydra. We have the Dreadnought, Jackhammer, Mankiller, and Mentalano, who are other forces within Hydra. We have Silvermane, who is the Supreme Hydra, all a part of that giant story arc involving Hydra and Foggy Nelson. We had Copperhead, who is Lawrence Chesney, who is the son of the man who posed for the covers of the Copperhead magazine, which is, I guess, a bit of a spoiler for the Spotlight that's coming up. So those were the new villains that we got to see during 1975. This week's Spotlight Story.
All right, Dwayne, so you've talked about a bunch of the other books. We've got two of them here, a double story that you want to go into a little more in depth. Tell us what it is you've chosen for this week's Spotlight.
All right, yes. The Spotlight for this week is Daredevil issues 124 and 125. That is August 1975 and then September. The first issue is In the Coils of the Copperhead, and the story ends with Vengeance is the Copperhead. So in this story, after having a solo adventure with Thing, Black Widow realizes that she wants to spend some time as a solo adventurer again and decides to leave Daredevil, telling him that she plans on coming back to him once she's found what she's looking for. So she leaves, and Daredevil is left to his own devices. And elsewhere in the city, we have a costume vigilante known as Copperhead has begun stalking the streets, shooting and killing a purse snatcher. And when the police officer attempts to stop him, Copperhead shoots him with a sleep dart and then places 2 pennies on his eyes of the crook he has gunned down. So we have a crook with a calling card on the streets, and so you assume that him and Daredevil are going to meet up, but they don't meet up just quite yet. First, we see at City Hall, Matt Murdock pays a visit to Foggy Nelson, who is having trouble with his campaign to get reelected as district attorney. Unable to divulge his part in smashing up Hydra due to secrecy issues, Foggy shows Matt his next hope at winning over voters, a crime computer that collects data from international sources so that the New York police force can capture crooks. When Foggy shows Daredevil the post of his opponent, Blake Towers, Foggy becomes visibly upset and loses his temper. They are then interrupted when Foggy is told by police about a murder committed by Copperhead. So now we know where the game's afoot, as I think Sherlock Holmes would say. Matt Murdock sees it and is now going to spring into action. So Matt finds that the crime is a copycat of an old pulp magazine, and that the killer has modeled himself after the character Copperhead. Decides to do some investigating. Going to an old bookshop, he picks up an old issue of Copperhead Monthly and finds the similarities remarkable. He then goes to seek out the writer of the old Copperhead pulp novels and learns that his former landlady, that he was murdered a few days ago. While out on patrol, he tries to figure out what his next lead is and comes across some muggers attempting to rob a pair of drug dealers. As Daredevil fights those muggers, the 2 drug dealers run into Copperhead. So Copperhead steps in and saves Daredevil from getting shot in the back. But when the man without fear realizes that Copperhead is the one murdering the crooks, he then attacks him. Daredevil is shocked to find that Copperhead is literally wearing a suit of copper armor and is thus easily knocked out by his foe. Copperhead then fires a killer dart at Daredevil. However, the man without fear's radar sense and fast-moving hands allow him to swat it away at the final moments. And thinking that he's killed the hero, Copperhead puts those 2 pennies over his eyes and departs the scene. Daredevil then gets up and tries to find Copperhead, but comes up empty. So that's basically how we end that first issue. Is we think Daredevil might be dead because he's been shot with a dart from Copperhead, and gets the coins on his eyes, and Copperhead walks away thinking, job is done. But then we find out at the start of the next issue. So you had to wait a whole month to find out that Daredevil was not in fact dead, that he was able to, without even Copperhead seeing, be able to swat the dart away and fake being dead long enough for him to think he was good and walk away.
So what did you think of the Gene Colan and Klaus Janson teaming here? So I loved the art in this one. So Colan came back, I think, for only like one book this year. Maybe there was another one, but I know this one. And him and Klaus Janson are really an interesting team. Because, again, you talk about somebody who's got a strong enough style that they can kind of rein in Janson. That would be Gene Colan. But Colan's style and Janson's, I think, really complement each other in a lot of ways, too. So this art is just phenomenal. It's moody and it's dense and it's wonderful.
There is sort of a noir feel to this book.
Absolutely.
And it does kind of harken back to those kind of thriller espionage almost sort of thing. And like the actual look of Copperhead is really interesting because he is basically just a guy in a copper suit, but he's got like a hat, like a detective's hat sort of thing on, and the trench coat, and so it does sort of have that noir look. And so you see Daredevil punch him, and then suddenly you see his hand shaking, and there's like noise reverberation off of the chest of Copperhead, and it looked good. And to your point, I think the story is good, but I think the look of the book actually elevated the story even more.
Yeah. The other thing is, they're definitely playing on the pulp stuff because Copperhead is basically 3 pulp heroes in one, from what I've read. That he looks a lot like Doc Savage. He's got because Doc Savage has that bronze skin and he's kind of whatever. Only this guy's actually got bronze armor on. He's got the hat and the coat of the Shadow, like the Shadow nose type of stuff. And then his origin story actually comes from the Black Bat, who's another one of those characters from back in the day. He was also scarred by acid and then turned into an Avenger of the Night because of it. So they kind of amalgamated a bunch of these old noir heroes and came up with this vigilante and then pitted Daredevil against him with exactly the right artist doing the job.
Yeah.
So, pretty cool.
All right, so the next day, Matt meets up with Foggy Nelson again, who is still confident that his crime database computer that they are building will be the key to getting him reelected as district attorney. However, Matt is concerned that Foggy isn't doing enough to prevent crime. The conversation is cut short when the latest of Blake Tower's attack ads is aired, sending Foggy into another fury. And oh my goodness, it basically is Foggy Nelson on TV getting a pie thrown in his face, for lack of a better thing. Is basically they're making fun of him.
Exactly it.
And it's ridiculous. So that night, Copperhead seeks out and murders Milton Wexler, the rights owner of the Copperhead Pulps, who has been making money on the reprints. Later, learning of this murder, Murdock investigates as Daredevil. Although the police send him away, Daredevil then sneaks in and snoops around Wexler's office. Shortly thereafter, inside he finds a safe containing a detailed notebook, revealing the origins of Copperhead. Daredevil then tracks down Copperhead at the offices of the publisher currently reprinting the Copperhead serials. Battling the Man Without Fear is easily overpowered, and Copperhead escapes. Daredevil then does manage to track him down this time, revealing that he knows Copperhead is really Lawrence Chesney, the son of the man who posed for the covers of the Copperhead magazine way back in the 30s. He explains that his father became embittered due to the lack of royalties, going insane, and when the pulp stories began recirculating. And before dying, he convinced his son to avenge him. Hence the whole becoming the man that he had been back when he was taking those pictures and going out and being this crime fighter. So in denial, Copperhead attempts to attack Daredevil. However, he is suddenly struck by a bolt of lightning and is killed. Daredevil then tosses 2 pennies that land over Copperhead's eyes. A fitting end, I guess, to the character, given his calling card.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those real quick end sort of things where we had lots of build up and then it just sort of end rather anticlimactically, because we did get a little bit of attack and a little bit of fighting, but it was ultimately this random bolt of lightning that hits the guy in a copper armor that ends up ending the fight.
Yes, this is classic. Gene Colan is involved. He probably ate up like the better part of the first, entire issue with the first 5 pages of the script, and then they had to panically consolidate everything to get it done or something like this. But in any case, it was a quick ending, but I think it worked, and it's always interesting seeing how a vigilante deals with other vigilantes. And the fact that this, in some ways even, with the Punisher coming out and the like, this is another version of that anti-hero. And that at this point, Marvel still is not ready to say, hey, just killing all the bad guys is okay, so he's gotta pay the price at the end, right? Within a few years, Copperhead and the Punisher are going to be basically indistinguishable, and one of them gets his own book and the other dies ignominiously. So there you go.
Yeah, I liked this story. We talked about the look of this story through these 2 books. I really liked that. I liked kind of the fact that it was sort of kind of pulled from comics. Like it was sort of a meta thing almost in that you have this character that was based on a comic in a comic, and then you had this hero that had to go fight him. I thought it was really interesting. I liked. This is one of the more interesting, I guess, villains that we've seen in a while for Daredevil, and so I think spotlighting when we get a decent villain for the character, even if he only lasts a couple issues, I thought it was something worth spotlighting this week.
Yep, and always the best villains always have a little bit in something in common with the heroes, and so again, somebody who has had something bad in their past, something traumatic, in this case both of them involving their father, and one of them decides to, become a vigilante for good, and one decides to become a vigilante for evil, and so you get a chance to develop the character and stuff like that too. I think it would have been nice if Copperhead had maybe not been murdered so ignominiously there, but which is the way.
This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, I think we've pretty thoroughly covered 1975, talked about the year in comics, we talked about the year at Marvel, looked at Daredevil. What should be the takeaway for this week and this year?
So, my takeaway is that there really are, like, the inmates are running the asylum at Marvel right now. And there are some just crazy stories going on if you look for them. We had our Nixon story of a couple of years ago and things like that and all this. But Steve Gerber is kind of coming off the leash right now. He has been working for Marvel for 2 or 3 years. He's starting to take over more and more books and do more and more stuff. And he is just writing things that they would drive people today nuts. I don't know. Did you get a chance to read that Defenders story, the 2-part Defenders story this week?
I did not.
So, he had 2 Defenders things he did this during this year that Daredevil was in. One of them is a giant-sized Defenders that actually has like random text pages in it. So when he's talking with the Grandmaster, there's like a half a page that's just written out in almost like script format where it's people talking. And then there's another page that's the rules of the game that you can read through and stuff like this. No art in it or anything like that. It's just sort of typed.
Weird.
The stories have all these crazy, trippy sorts of elements and everything like that. You get to the actual Defenders story, It's a two-part story. The first story is called In the Jaws of the Serpent. It's about the Sons of the Serpent, who are this ultra-racist, white power sort of supervillain group that is dedicated to essentially taking back America for white people. And they have captured the Defenders, and they're holding them hostage, and they're telling them their story of how they're going to essentially destroy American cities, making them unlivable, and then forcing all of the people and minorities and the like who live there out into the suburbs where white people have had to flee, and that the white people then will have to make a decision of whether to live with them or not to, and that they're hoping that will then cause race war and the extermination of all of the non-white people in the country.
Wow.
And they're using really offensive language, and it is absolutely just nuts how political it is. You get to the point where Valkyrie breaks free, and they're able to stop her, and they're like, oh, white race traitor, and eventually they then hang her up upside down on a cross and are going to crucify and burn her. And you just see all this story going through. At the very end, it turns out that the leader of the Sons of the Serpent is actually Nightwing's sort of business manager, who's a black guy, who's doing all of this because he believes that somehow it's going to help, like, Nightwing's company's stock price or something like this. And Luke Cage is there and gets, you know, basically tries to kill the guy. He's like, what are you doing, man? Calls him an Oreo and all the rest of it. It is just batshit what is going on in Defenders 24 and 25. And then, you know, at the same time, he's over revitalizing Howard the Duck and dropping resurrected talking ducks in the middle of Cleveland where they can have adventures with Dr. Bong and everything else. And it's so interesting seeing what's going on with these right now, where when they are at their creative best, they are irreverent, they are political, they are hilarious, and to be quite frank, from everything I've been reading, Ween and Wolfman and everybody else is too overworked and too tired to care or to have any oversight. So guys like Starlin and Gerber can just do whatever the heck they want. It's fantastic. So the only thing stopping them is the comics code, so they have to be a little careful that it makes it through the code. But as long as the bad guys lose in the end and stuff like this, they seem to be able to do just about anything they want.
Wow.
Yeah, you should read those Defenders books. They are a gas.
Apparently so. I'm trying to make sure that I keep ahead of all the stories we've got coming up. But yeah, That is wow.
And then at the end, the other thing that's hilarious is we've got one of the famous Elf with a Gun appearances, which for a while in various books that Gerber was doing, there would just be this little dude, literally like a 3-foot tall dude in an elf hat who would randomly show up on people's doorsteps and just murder them. And it was never explained why or what's happening. He was just an elf with a gun. And so it's absolutely insane. So that
sounds like it.
Yeah, number 25 actually has an elf with the gun appearance. And there's just a couple people hanging out watching TV, and there's a knock on the door, and the guy goes to answer it. And the guy standing there is the elf, and he's like, oh, honey, who is it? And he says, tell her. He's like, it's an elf with a gun. And then you just see blam, blam. And that's the end.
Oh, geez.
I don't believe any of it's ever referenced again. It's just, yeah.
It's just a thing that happens.
It's just a thing. There's just an elf with a gun running around the Defenders, primarily the Defenders universe, just randomly murdering people on the sidelines.
Okay. I think that is probably a great way to end this takeaway for this week.
There you go. Good stuff, man.
That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.